I'm also the host of the Green Tunnel podcast, a podcast on the history of the Appalachian Trail. I say Appalachian because although I'm originally from the part of Virginia where it's Appalachian, down in Franklin County, we moved up here when I was a kid, so I really kind of grew up in Falls Church. Hey, come on in. And you know, around here, people tend to say Appalachian. The Potomac River is the really hard dividing line. Nobody north of the Potomac says Appalachian. But you know, if you get down into the part of Virginia I'm going to talk about, it's very clearly Appalachian, and you better say it that way. and the people in the north don't care. Appalachian, they don't care. South of Shenandoah National Park, everybody cares. So anyway, I always have to do my little disclaimer about that. So today I want to tell you a story about a part of the history of the Appalachian Trail that almost nobody knows. And it's about the Appalachian Trail changes length every year. And this year picked up like almost 3 miles, and it gets longer, shorter, mostly longer every year. And when it was completed in 1937, completed for the first time, it was 2,050 miles long. This year it's 2,198 and change long. And actually the Washington Post had a really nice story about this exact thing just recently by Lizzie Johnson and Lauren Tierney. And it's really, really wonderful story about the history of all the kind of movings around of the trail and why that happened. And it's one of their interactive digital stories. They've got these interactive maps that you can move over, you see the trail move around on the map. So it's well worth taking a look at. I'm going to tell you the story of the single biggest relocation of the trail in its history. Because in 1952, the Appalachian Trail Conference, now Conservancy, moved 300 miles of the trail, about 50 miles to the west. They didn't just like route it over on this side of the mountain to get a better view. They moved it a long way, over a full 50 miles to the west. And at the time, that was 15% of the whole trail. And so that was by far the single biggest relocation. The next biggest was 37 miles, when they abandoned the last 37 miles in the south. So they gave up Mount Oglethorpe as the southern terminus and moved it up to Springer Mountain, where it is today, and so they gave up 37 miles of the trail. But in 1952, they abandoned 300 miles of the trail. And so I'm going to tell you that part of the story, but I'm also going to tell you what that meant to the communities where the trail used to be. Because the Appalachian Trail is both a recreational resource, but it's also an economic engine for small towns, for rural America, rural Eastern America. And it's a vehicle for cultural exchange. People coming from all over the country, all over the world to hike on the trail, stopping at little country stores. And you know, I was saying as people were coming in, I live half time in Linden, and the store at the bottom of the mountain right there at the Linden Crossroads, you know, caters to the hikers, which you know because you can buy Pop-Tarts by the sleeve. You don't have to buy the whole box, you just get a sleeve of Pop-Tarts. You know, they have a whole range of power bars and protein bars and that sort of thing. But so, you know, people from Germany, Australia, Japan, they come in, or the West Coast, you know, they come into this little country store in Linden, Virginia, which is just a little crossroads, and, you know, and chat with people who work there. And so it's a vehicle for that kind of cultural exchange also. So just for, you know, orientation purposes, I always like to show a map of the trail from Georgia to Maine. One of the reasons I always start with this is because I grew up in Falls Church, and my first experiences on the Appalachian Trail were as a Boy Scout, starting when I was 12. So that was 1971, and my scoutmaster at the time, Mr. Ballard, was a Pacific War veteran. He'd grown up in California, and he would be fired from the Boy Scouts today because nothing stopped us from going out except an ice storm. One time we did not go on a planned hike because of an ice storm. 5 below zero, just wear extra clothes. You know, it's gonna thunderstorms. Don't stand under a tall tree. You know, that was Mr. Ballard's attitude about things. And he used to take us to this trail in Shenandoah National Park called the Appalachian Trail. But he never once mentioned that it was anything more than a trail in Shenandoah National Park called the Appalachian Trail. And in 1972, or 73, I guess it was 73, a man named Ed Garvey, who lived right around the corner from where our Boy Scout troop met, he wrote a book about his through hike a couple of years earlier. And that was the first book about a through hike. It wasn't the first through hike, it was just the first published a book about it. And he came and talked about his experiences hiking from Georgia to Maine, and I remember thinking, wait, that trail we hike on in Shenandoah National Park goes all the way to Georgia, because my family's from Georgia, and you can hike all the way to Maine? That's crazy. I had no idea. So anyway, the Appalachian Trail from Georgia to Maine, and the part we're going to be talking about today is down here in Southwest Virginia, from Roanoke to Damascus. So sort of the southern third or so of the trail in Virginia. And these days, if you're hiking south on the trail, you get to McAfee Knob, which an awful lot of people have been to. It's certainly the most photographed place on the whole trail. And then you hike a little further, you come to the parking area that everybody uses to get to McAfee. And then the trail heads off southwest toward Dragon's Tooth. And then from Dragon's Tooth, it continues on toward Parisburg on the West Virginia border, and that's where you get across the New River on the Highway 460 bridge, and then you continue on down toward Blacksburg, and then it eventually hooks back through the Grayson Highlands. And so that's the blue line on this image. This blue line is the trail today. The red line is the original route of the trail. So you can see it's really different. Basically what happened was you got to McAfee Knob, and then you hiked out to that, it's Route 311 where the parking area is, and then it turned and went down Route 311 and then cut over cross country from there and headed down along the Floyd Franklin line down into Patrick County. It actually crossed into North Carolina for about 5 miles and then hooked back up and crossed over the New River outside of the little town of Freeze. And then instead of going through the Grayson Highlands, it ran along the Iron Mountain Range instead. And so that's and this yellow line is just, that was the original proposal. They never actually used that, which is good because it was not very good at all. But so that's the trail I'm going to be talking about, is that red line instead of the blue line, which people know today. And the way I got to this story was I was working in the archives of the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. They used to be in Harpers Ferry. They're now at George Mason University. And I found this particular letter from 1929, and it was written by Myron Avery, who was about to become the chairman of the Appalachian Trail Conference, but it was written to a judge in Connecticut, Arthur Perkins, who was the chair of the Appalachian Trail Conference. Perkins was about to retire from that role. His health was failing. Avery was about to take over. And so Avery wrote this long letter to Perkins, in which he said, "We have figured out the route of the trail from Georgia to Maine, with 2 exceptions. The whole state of Maine. We don't know what we're going to do in Maine yet. But Avery was from Maine, and so he wasn't worried about that. He'd written a book about Mount Katahdin before he came to Washington as a lawyer. And but then he said, and Southern Virginia is our terra incognita." And the reason he said that was that he had 2 problems. The first was that he didn't know anyone in Southern Virginia. He didn't know anyone south of Roanoke. And the Appalachian Trail has always been a volunteer-run resource. And so Avery had helped start the Natural Bridge Club in Lynchburg and the Roanoke Club. He was the president of the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club already. And so from the Potomac River down to Roanoke, he knew lots of people. But when you got south of Roanoke, you didn't really know anybody at all who could form a volunteer club to help with the trail. And the other problem was there just weren't any good maps. The Geological Survey had not done a good job of mapping that part of the state. The most recent map was from the 1890s, and so it was almost 40 years old. And so the town of Galax, which the furniture manufacturing town of Galax, which was the largest population center in that area of the state, wasn't even on the map. Because Galax was founded in 1905. And so the Geological Survey was just way behind on mapping that part of the state. And when they first started trying to figure out what to do, they were actually looking at some old Civil War ordnance maps from Confederate engineers, trying to figure out where do these roadbeds go, that kind of thing. So Avery was really stumped as to what to do to get the trail from Roanoke to Damascus. They had managed to route the trail all the way from Georgia up to the Virginia-Tennessee line at Damascus, but they just didn't know what to do in between those 2 places. And so he was really concerned about it. And then something happened which he really didn't like. And Myron Avery, you would charitably describe him as a control freak. That was being nice. And so I mean, he saw the Appalachian Trail as kind of his. He was very possessive of the whole thing. And so one day he gets a letter from the man in the foreground, whose name is Shirley Cole. Cole was the county agent of Floyd County, the first county agent. The Agricultural Extension Service had just gotten started. And Cole wrote to Avery and said, I've solved the problem of getting the trail from the peaks of Otter outside of Lynchburg all the way down to Damascus. And Avery had kind of a freak out because he didn't know who this man was. And he didn't want somebody he didn't know deciding where his, Myron Avery's, trail should go. And so right away he wrote to the guy in the cowboy hat. One of the things I love about this picture, these are two Georgia foresters, and one of them's just got a 6-shooter stuck in his belt. And this is a photo from the late 1920s. And so the guy on the right is named Roy Osmer, and he had scouted the trail from the whole trail in Georgia, and helped lay that all out, and had actually attempted a through hike of the trail in 1928, but fell and broke a couple of vertebrae in his back, and so stopped. But he was a really, really interesting guy. Later became a famous hermit in Florida, strangely enough. But he was somebody who Myron Avery trusted and knew and understood. And so Avery wrote to Osmer, and he said, Roy, I need you in Virginia, and I need you now, because we can't let, he said, those local people decide where our trail should go. So you got to get up here. And so Osmer said, sure, I'm on my way. I'll show up at the Peaks of Otter at the Hotel Mons, and I'll be ready to go. And so apparently if you were in the Georgia Forest Service, you could just take a couple of months off to scout a trail and keep your job. But Osmer did make a request which Avery found difficult to tolerate, and that was Myron Avery. He had a measuring wheel, and he measured everything. I said he was charitably described as a control freak. Well, if a trail club, they were constantly updating their trail guides, and if you, for instance, wrote and said, okay, we rerouted this section of the trail, and it's now 7.2 miles from point A to point B, he didn't believe you, and he would go to where you had done this with his measuring wheel, and he would measure it out, and then he would write you a fairly tart letter that you told me it was 7.2 miles, but I measured it myself, and it's 7.35 miles. In future, I expect greater accuracy. That kind of thing. Wow. And he was just that way. And one of his children, his youngest son, Hal, did an oral history with the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club back in around 2000 when Hal was in his late 80s. And he said he and his older brother really resented this behavior by their father for a particular reason, and that is that Myron Avery never learned how to drive. And so his children had to drive him to various locations along the trail on the weekends. And as Hal said, we just wanted to go out with girls. We didn't want to drive our dad to the trail in Pennsylvania or Tennessee or whatever. So Osmer shows up and he says, but I want to borrow your measuring wheel. And Myron Avery writes back and says, no, can't have my measuring wheel. I've only seen one photograph of somebody other than Myron Avery with that wheel, and that was Jean Stevenson, she was his sort of right-hand person in the ATC. And there's some video of her measuring something, and I thought, wow, that's the only person I've ever seen. He must have really trusted her. But so he arranged to have a measuring wheel sent to Osborne. And so Osborne takes off, starts measuring out some trail, and he immediately gets lost. And the reason he gets lost is because he picked up on, he started trying to use an old roadbed, which was kind of standard procedure for trail building in those days. If there was an old mountain road, let's just use that because it's easier than cutting trails through the forest. But along the Floyd County, Franklin County line, which is where the Blue Ridge Parkway runs today, there are all these water gaps, 32 of them, in fact. And so Osmer's going down into the creek and then back up, but he's just trying to circumvent. And he just finally got lost. And so he did the one thing he wasn't supposed to do. He went to the town of Floyd and he looked up Shirley Cole. And he said, the guy, they were trying to do an end run around, and he said, Mr. Cole, can you show me that proposal you've had? And Cole said, sure, I'd love to do that. That would be great. And so they drove all over that part of the state. And then Osmer wrote this 11-page single-spaced memo to Avery saying, I have solved all the problems. here's where the trail should go, sort of point by point by point. And in the very last paragraph, one of the last sentences, it says, and by the way, Mr. Shirley Cole was very helpful to me while I was doing this. And so Avery then in triumph writes to his boss, Judge Perkins, and says, we've solved the problem of Southern Virginia. Mr. Osmer was incredibly helpful to us once again, and so now we're going to start laying out the trail. So that's how they picked that particular route. This is kind of what it looked like. Lots of old road beds. I took this picture in 2019, I think, down around Fancy Gap. That part of Virginia is very, very foggy. It's the great escarpment of Virginia. It's up on this high plateau, and it's a foggy place. Most of it's up around 3,000 feet or above, and for whatever reason, it's just pretty foggy. and in fact, Fancy Gap used to be known as Foggy Camp. That was the original name of the town. And the trail guides themselves are priceless because they're all have all these really wonderful directions. Like when you get to the County Line Baptist Church, turn left. Continue for 2.6 miles. When you get to the Edwardsville store, cross the road and turn right. You can see the Edwardsville store needs some love. I took that picture in 2021. I think somebody has at least shored up the front porch so that it's not going to fall on anyone. So that's how the directions went. And those old trail guides are full of those kinds of directions. Like, the one in Montebello at the base of along the Tye River in central Virginia, there's a great direction that says, cross the river, circumvent the Little League field on the right, good hot dogs in the concession stand, and behind center field, the trail continues up the mountain, that kind of thing. They're really wonderful artifacts. The trail in that part of the state had some really spectacular geography. It wasn't all road walking on old abandoned roads. This is the Pinnacles of Dan. This is a photograph that Myron Avery took. And I've never understood why it's Pinnacles plural, because there's only one. But it is the Pinnacles of Dan, and it's in the Dan River Gorge at the headwaters of the Dan River. And it's just like this pyramid that was dropped down into the gorge. And we're looking at it from the west side, and the trail kind of came up to the top and went back down the other side. Coming from this side, there was a trail that had been there for a couple of decades. There was nothing on the other side because this trail just took you to the top for the view, and then you walked back down. So they rooted it up and over the top. And hikers who hike through there describe that as the second most difficult part of the entire Appalachian Trail. With Mahoosuc Notch always wins because you have to climb rebar up a granite face. But the Pinnacles of Dan are really, really difficult to get over. I interviewed in 2019 Gene Espy, who was the second person to through hike the trail. He did it in 1951. Gene was 91 the day that I talked to him, and still alive as far as I know. Yeah, and talked to his daughter in late 2021. Gene and his wife Eugenia. They grew up in very small town Georgia, and you can just imagine in high school, somebody saying, "Gene, you have to ask Eugenia, come on," or vice versa. But so they, both in their 90s, and they both got COVID. They both survived it. Just really tough people. But I asked Gene. I said, "Do you remember hiking over the Pinnacles of Dan?" And he said, "Oh, I remember." And I said, "How was it?" He said, "It was horrible. It was the worst part of the whole trail." But it's just really beautiful. And down in the bottom of the Dan River Gorge, there are just spectacular waterfalls. There are now also two really beautiful lakes there because the Danville Power Company built two dams at the headwaters of the river. But the waterfalls are still there. You can still get to them. There was one shelter built along that 300-mile stretch of trail. And this one is along the Blue Ridge Parkway, right on the Floyd Franklin line, and it's right near Tuggles Gap. And there's a turnout on the Blue Ridge Parkway called the Saddle. And if you pull in there, you stop, you get out of your car, and you look out over the Piedmont. It's just a beautiful view. And then you notice there's this little trail going off to the right, next to where the parking lot ends. That's the old Appalachian Trail. And there's no sign. You just have to know. And you go about a quarter mile uphill, and there's that shelter that was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. And because it was built by the CCC, it's still solid as it was in the 1930s, because those CCC guys, they love cement.
What's the name of it?
It doesn't have a name. It's just there, and there's no historic markers, no nothing, and so I didn't even know it was there. I just had been following the trail directions and one of the old trail guides, and I thought, I wonder if that's the old AT. And I started walking up, and there it was. This shelter would not be allowed today because I'm looking at it from back to the side, and you can see a little bit there. There's a front door to the shelter, and if you go out the front door of the shelter, the first step is great, second step is great, the third step it's about 300 feet straight down. And the National Park Service, which now has supervisory authority over the Appalachian Trail, they wouldn't allow that. they would have the shelter torn down if it was on the Appalachian Trail. But it's still solid as can be. And a number of the early thru hikers spent the night there. Mostly though, people stayed when they were hiking along the trail. They stayed in people's homes, and and this is part of that cultural exchange that I was talking about. People all along the trail took in boarders, and so this is the largest house in Carroll County, Virginia. It's in Fancy Gap. It's the Sidna Allen House. And if you know anything about the history of Carroll County, you know about the shootout in the courthouse in the first decade of the 20th century. A local moonshiner was arrested because when he was getting arrested by a sheriff's deputy, he decided he didn't want to be arrested, and he beat up the sheriff's deputy. So not only was he on trial for moonshining, but also for assaulting an officer of the law. He was convicted, sentenced to a year in jail, and he stood up in the witness box and he said to the judge, "I ain't a-going." And he reached into his pocket and he pulled out a pistol and started shooting, as did his two brothers, one of whom was Sidna Allen, and they started shooting, and by the time it was over, the county government was gone.
Oh, wow.
They had killed the judge, the justice of the peace, the prosecuting attorney, the foreperson of the jury, and a couple other people. And so the postmaster was the only official still in Hillsville that was in any way connected to the government. And he called Richmond and said, "We need a militia." And they sent actually the Baldwin Phelps Detective Agency from Roanoke. And it looked like right out of the OK Corral. I mean, these guys came riding down on horseback with Winchester rifles in their saddles, and went chasing after the Allens. And they caught Sidna actually in Iowa. They tracked him all the way to Iowa. He couldn't afford to pay his lawyer, and so he gave the house to his lawyer, who then sold it to a family named Webb. And by the time the Appalachian Trail came along, only Mrs. Webb was still alive, Erna Webb, and she took in boarders, hikers. And for $1, you got dinner, a hot bath, and breakfast. And there's no way that she didn't tell the hikers the story I just told you about the shootout. I mean, because that's like the biggest thing that has ever happened in Carroll County, Virginia. And still, it's the biggest thing. And I mean, when I went for the first time, I was talking to a man named Carl, who was a little antique store in Fancy Gap. He said, "Well, you know about the courthouse shooting, right?" I said, "No, I don't know." He told me the whole story in much greater detail than I just told you. And I said, "Well, Carl, that's amazing. When was that?" Because it sounded like 1975, the way he was telling it. He's like, "Oh, it was like 1903 or something like that." But to him, it was still very present. So it was still a recent thing. So that's one of the places people stayed. Or the trail went right down Main Street in Galax, and so you could have stayed at the Bluemont Hotel. Earl Schaefer, the first thru hiker, that's where he stayed as he passed through. Or you could have stayed at a fire tower. There were lots and lots of fire towers along the trail in those days. There are very few fire towers left in Virginia. And as far as I know, none with a really big house on top. They're just the little sort of fire observation towers, a little box on top. But the tower keepers would let people either stay in their accommodation or sleep around on the porch. Gene Espy told me that he has it in his book too, that he spent the night on one of those decks, and he roped himself in just in case he rolled over and he had to sleep. But the views on the far side of the New River, the views were really spectacular. This is the Skulls Gap, looking out toward Mount Rogers in the distance, and so it was really beautiful. And then eventually you ended up in Damascus on the Tennessee line and connected to the existing part of the trail. That's the 1948 train station in Damascus. I don't think it's there anymore. And so that was the trail. And people, there weren't a ton of people hiking the trail in those days, not like today. It was dozens and who would hike through in any given year. And only only 6 actual through hikers passed through this section of the trail, because they were all in, Earl Schaefer in 1948, and then 3 people in 1951, and then 3 more in 1952, and so was that 7 through hikers. But lots of Boy Scout troops or like there was a group of hikers from Philadelphia, 2 men and a woman, and who passed through in the late 1930s during their section hike of the trail. They section hiked the whole trail, and so they came through. So it wasn't really busy, but people did come through. And then in 1952, they abandoned this whole section of the trail for 2 reasons. One, they couldn't keep a volunteer organization in place. It was the Great Depression and then the Second World War, and it was a very unpopulated part of the state, so they couldn't keep a volunteer club operating to take care of the trail. And so that was a problem. And then the opportunity was that the Jefferson National Forest had expanded dramatically in the 1930s and the 1940s, largely because farmers were abandoning their farms during the Depression and moving away, and the federal government was just buying up all that land and converting it to national forest. And so all of a sudden there was all this federal land that they could move the trail to and have federal protection for the land and get a little help from the Forest Service. And so it was a problem, couldn't keep a volunteer club together, and an opportunity, federal protection. So in 1951, they declared this is the last year we're going to use the old route. 1952, they said this is the last year for the old route. And then in 1953, they issued new trail guides, and they wrote the old route out of the story, because the trail guides now say go this other way. And so unless you knew about the old route, there was no way to know. And so it just vanished, but it didn't vanish from the memories of the people who lived there. So this is Doug Bell, and Doug does not remember the trail because he's not old enough. He was born in 1956, I think, 55, and but he was raised by his grandfather, and his grandfather remembered the trail very well for a reason I'll tell you in a second. And he used to tell Doug all these stories about the hikers and about the trail and how cool it was. And Doug is standing in front of the ruins of the house he grew up in. It burned in the late 1960s when he was a teenager. And so he took me up there. He wanted to show me exactly where he'd been raised. He wanted to show me his home place and where the trail had been on their family property. And he gave me a copy of this picture. And so in that photograph, the first photograph, he's standing right in front of the house right there. And the trail used to go, when they first laid it out, it kind of cut across the corner of the farm this way and headed down the hill. But his grandfather moved the trail markers. and so he brought the trail this way, down between the chicken house and the woodshed, then past the front door, and then down the hill. And he did that because he wanted the hikers to stop. He wanted to knock on the door, and he wanted to chat with them. And maybe sell them some eggs or some zucchinis during the summer or whatever. And so, it was a very casual thing, and Doug was full of stories about the hikers that his grandfather had told him about. And so for him, the fact that the Appalachian Trail used to go across his family's farm was a really important part of his personal story. And he really wanted me to know that. He really wanted to take me up there. It was a kind of hard hike for him. One of his legs was not what it used to be, and so it was really sweet for him to take me there. Possibly my favorite person who I met during all my research down in that part of the state was Ralph Barnard, and this is his wife Hope. And the Barnards, people kept saying to me when I was wandering around just talking to folks in the area, well, you need to talk to Ralph, but I have to warn you. They would always say, I have to warn you about Ralph. He's a little difficult or crusty. That was another one, crusty. 2 different people told me it was crusty. And I'm not sure who exactly they were talking about, because Ralph has been anything but difficult or crusty with me. He was a little hard to get in touch with, though, because I called. He doesn't have email or Facebook or any of that stuff, and so I called. I said, "Hi, my name's Mills Kelly. I'm a professor of Click." I called back and I said, and then Hope answered, and I said, please don't hang up. My name is, and click. And so they assumed I was a telemarketer, because why wouldn't they make that assumption, right? We all get plenty of those calls. So I had to resort to desperate measures. I wrote them a letter. I wrote them a letter, and they wrote right back, "Oh, we would love to see you. Sorry we hung up on you." And so I drove down a couple weeks later, and the Pinnacles of Dan used to be Barnard family property, because the Barnard family came to Meadows of Dan, Virginia, right after the Revolutionary War. They received a land, his ancestor had received a land grant for his service in Washington's army. And so they got there, they pushed the Cherokee out and took up their land, which included the Pinnacles of Dan. And that trail that went up to the summit, his grandfather had made. And Ralph was also raised by his grandfather, John Barnard. And Ralph remembers the hikers really well, because he was 15 when the trail moved away. And he said he used to take them up to the top of the Pinnacles, and the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club used to come down there for a long weekend every year to do trail work, and they would stay at the Barnard family farm. And here they are, at the Barnard family farm. And bonus points if you can pick out Myron Avery in the photo. The guy with the wheel. That's him. There are very few photographs of Myron Avery where he does not have either a wheel or an axe. Because if he's chopping wood, he's not holding his wheel. But he liked to have a lot of pictures of him in a, sort of tank top undershirt with an axe. He was big on those photos. I think he thought he looked good, his shoulders looked good or something. But this house in the background, this framed house in the background, that's the same house that Ralph and Hope are standing on the front porch. And Ralph was a brick mason, and so in his spare time, he bricked that old frame house up and turned it into a brick house. But so they would come down, and Ralph told me that one of his main jobs was they all stayed in the barn, and one of his main jobs was to go out and tell them no smoking in the barn. He said, they were city folks. They didn't know about hay and cigarettes. This was a bad idea. And so I've visited with them many times now. They've become really good friends, and it's really wonderful. And but like this photograph was not in an archive; it was in a shoebox in Ralph's closet. So many of the sort of archival sources I have for the book came out of people's closets in Southwestern Virginia. They just shared it with me. The Barnard family home is also really important for this story that was in the National Geographic magazine in 1949. It was the first sort of national media attention for the Appalachian Trail, and the writer for the National Geographic stayed at the Barnard family home, and he has this paragraph that I quote in the book where he talks about this sort of, it was just this kind of lyrical description of sitting on the Barnard family front porch while Mr. Barnard was finishing his chores, and Mrs. Barnard was back in the kitchen cooking, and the thunderstorm was just coming through, and swallows were flying around, catching the gnats off the top of the grass, and the hydrangeas are blooming, and the lilacs are blooming. And the second time I visited with Ralph, I realized I'm sitting in that story, because I was sitting on their front porch, a thunderstorm had just blown through, the swallows were flying, and I got all sort of goosebumpy, because not a lot had changed there. The cars were newer, the house had brick, but the hospitality was really the same. This particular story is especially important. A few years later, a farm wife in Ohio named Emma Gatewood read this story and thought, I'm going to hike that Appalachian Trail. And she told her oldest daughter, I'm going to go take a hike. And her daughter said, okay, Mom. And her daughter was like in her 30s at this point. And so what Emma didn't tell her daughter was she was going to Maine, and she was going to try to hike the Appalachian Trail all the way to Georgia. She failed that first year. She dropped her glasses, stepped on them, broke them, and then she couldn't see a thing. And so she got lost. And you can get lost in the woods of Maine, especially in the early 1950s. And so some rangers found her. They put her on a bus. They sent her home. The next year, she went to Georgia and hiked north. And the national media picked her up, and she became Grandma Gatewood, the most famous of all the AT hikers. And so this was the story. That's like that's like the family tree of how that all worked out. The last family I'll tell you about, who I've become really close with as a result of working on the book, is the Dixon family. And the Dixons also came to the New River Valley after the Revolutionary War, also with a land grant. And this bridge over the New River is Dixon's Ferry Bridge. and because the Dixons used to run a ferry there, and eventually the state put in a highway and a bridge. But you can see the new river's pretty wide there, and it's a good 50 yards wide at least. And so I found the Dixons through a genealogy forum. I was just posting anywhere I could find somebody who might know something about the old Appalachian Trail. And so there's the New River Valley Genealogy Forum, and I posted something there. And Paula Dixon Rakes wrote to me and said, my mom remembers the hikers. So I went down to visit with them, and Sally's her mom. Sally's in her 80s, and she remembers the hikers also. And she was just a little girl at the time, but she still remembers them. And this is Dixon's Ferry. Not very fancy. It's Redbird is the name of their little ferry boat. That's Sally's father, Charlie Dixon, and his father, whose name I now forget. But again, it's a photo that was in a shoebox in a closet, and so to my knowledge, it's the only photograph of Dixon's Ferry that the hikers used to use. And for a nickel, they would get you across the river. And if you were hiking south, you just went up to the Dixon's door and you knocked and said, "Could you put me across?" And either Mr. and Mrs. Dixon would put you across the river. And if you were hiking north, you had to stand on the far shore and yell. And so when I talked to Gene Espy, I said, "So Gene, how was it getting across the river?" And he said, "I had to yell for a long time." And when I talked to Sally the first time, I said, "Did your family ever consider, maybe putting a bell on the other side of the river, or one of those triangles that the mess hall guys use?" And she thought about it for a minute. And she said, "That would have been a really good idea." So, and I said, "Well, by any chance, do you remember a man from Georgia named Gene Espy?" And she said, "Oh, I remember Mr. Espy. He was so sweet. When he got to Maine, when he finished his hike, he sent us a postcard, and my mom kept it on he had postcards made of himself at the end of his hike, and she said, my mom kept it on the refrigerator for years, and she said he would send us Christmas cards, and so when I talked to Gene, I said, "Do you remember the Dixons?" He said, "Oh yes, Mrs. Dixon came and got me, and she took me, after all the yelling, got me across the river, and so I said, "Well, do you remember their daughter Sally?" And he said, "Yeah, I remember her. She was a little girl and she wouldn't come out. She was behind the screen door." And he said, "I really love children and I really wanted her to come out and talk to me. And she just wouldn't." So the next time I was back in Virginia, I asked Sally, I said, "Why wouldn't you come out when Mr. Espy wanted to talk to you?" And she said, "Well, he had a beard." and I said, "Why was that a problem?" And she said, "Well, my father had always told me to stay away from men with beards because they were either hobos or communists." And now, of course, if you go on the Appalachian Trail, pretty much every male hiker who's been on the trail for more than a week has a beard. Interestingly, though, most hikers in the old days shaved every day. They mostly shaved every day. So Espy was unusual in that sense that he did not shave. So Earl Schaefer, the first through hiker, he was a Marine, and so first thing he did every morning was get himself all cleaned up and ready to go. And I've become really close with the Dixon family. Also, they a couple of years ago they invited me to the family reunion down on the river, and they still have one little patch of land on the river. They don't have the house anymore, but just a place they picnic and fish and stuff like that. And so Sally's brother, Griggs, came up to me and he said, "I hear you're writing a book about my family." And I said, "That's right. Well, your family figures in the book." And he said, "And I hear you're a college professor." I said, "That's right, I am." And he said, "You must be a liberal." And I said, "That's right, I am." And he said, "Well, I don't get to talk to a lot of liberals. Can we sit?" And I said, "Sure." And so we sat down and we talked for a good hour about everything except politics.
Wow.
He wanted to show me a picture of this giant catfish one of his grandsons had caught the week before, and he wanted to tell me about one of the old hikers he remembered, and he wanted to know about my kids, and we talked about everything, and we never talked about liberal or conservative. And when I was driving home, I was thinking about it, that was a really good lesson, because living here in the Washington area, we tend to think of everything as like this, and
that's true.
Other people don't just see the world quite the same way as we tend to here in the DC area, at least not quite as much. And so, so I've become really, really close with a lot of people as a result of working on this book. And so it's been, I never anticipated that it was going to be this much joy in the process. Usually, historians, we work in the archives, we're writing about people who are dead, and the people who are the main characters in the book, they're all dead. But like, I talked to Shirley Cole's daughter, who was in her 90s when I spoke to her. She lived in Waynesboro, and it was during COVID, and so I couldn't actually go, so we had to talk on the phone, and I keep asking her to turn the TV down. But we had a really wonderful conversation, and Dorothy Shiplett's her name, and so it turned into this book, which I had not planned on writing. I just found that letter from Myron Avery about the Terra Incognita, and it was like this rabbit hole that opened up in front of me. I was working on a whole different book about the Appalachian Trail, and in part because what I found didn't make any sense to me, and I had to figure it out. But also because I'm originally from that part of the state, that gave me a little more of a connection. And I thought, and I might have stopped if I hadn't gotten in my car and driven down and just started driving around and talking to people in stores and diners, and slowly but surely assembling a crew of friends who helped me with the project. And so it's been kind of an unusual experience for me as a historian. So it's been a lot of fun. And we also have the Green Tunnel podcast, the podcast on the history of the trail, and we've been really gratified at the response to this podcast. As of last week, we've had 120,000 downloads of our episodes. And so that's a lot of people. It's not 120,000 people, but it's tens of thousands of people listening to that show. And so it's been really, really fun. And it's on all the podcast platforms. Those of you who came in late, I have stickers for you so that you can listen to it. But I thought I would just read you, this is a little bit from the very end of the book, because this is a book I did not, as I told my kids, I did not write this book for my colleagues in the history department. I wrote this book for y'all and for the people who I got to know. So there's not one footnote in the whole book, which makes my colleagues a little twitchy. I list my sources in the back, but it's not. If I were writing this as an academic history, it would be very encumbered by footnotes, and those are very important, and I insist that my students use footnotes in their research paper. But yes, sometimes it's hard to read because of all the footnotes.
No, I was just saying, but nobody would read it if it's an academic book.
Right. So this little reading here will give you a sense for how it's not an academic book. The Appalachian Trail left its original route in southwestern Virginia at the end of the 1952 hiking season and quickly passed out of the knowledge of the vast majority of the Appalachian Trail community. Because it was written out in the trail guides, hikers passing north and south in ever-growing numbers had no way to learn that they were missing out on the pinnacles of Dan, the climb up Farmer Mountain with its 360-degree views of the New River Valley, or the opportunity to see the second highest waterfall in Virginia up on Bent Mountain. But the trail left many traces on the landscape of this region, some of which are still easily read today. The Galax chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution is the Appalachian Trail chapter, although the current local DAR leaders aren't sure why. I said, do you know why it's called that? No, we don't. I said, well, the Appalachian Trail used to run right down Main Street in Galax. Really? Maybe that's why. Several roads still bear the name Appalachian Trail, and if you know where to look, you can still find rusty old Appalachian Trail markers on trees, likely put there by Shirley Cole and Myron Avery back in 1931. These are the tangible things. The intangible things are just as important. All of us have a place where we feel the most connected, the most comfortable, the place where we know the way things smell, how the wind blows, how people talk, and what everyone is eating. Even in this seemingly rootless world where jet planes shuttle millions through the air every day, where people move with increasing frequency in search of jobs, of water, of security, to get away from war, fire, or famine, most humans are still rooted in their places, the places they've named, the places they know best. In the South, that place isn't just a place, it's a home place. And home places are endowed with even greater significance than ordinary locations. Every home place, wherever it is, has its own stories. And then these are a few stories that people told me when I was talking to folks. Over there, that's where lightning hit that tree. And right here, that's where we first met. Up there on the mountain, that's where those folks were lost for 3 days. And then my favorite, you can see it down there where the river bends. That's where our neighbor's son found that dead bear. 2 different people told me about the dead bear. Places become a code, a shorthand for stories that define who we are, who we've been, and who we will be. Physical geography, buildings, soundscapes, smells, they provide the boundaries, the parameters for memory, for understanding, for teaching, and most of all, for belonging. But just as important as those physical things, if not more so, are the stories. The stories the Dixon family members tell about poling hikers across the river in Redbird, Ralph Barnard's tales of hikers and their fear of panthers, and the hope that Richard Farmer still holds out for Freeze. He was the mayor of Freeze, Virginia, when I talked to him. Dorothy Shiplett's stories of building trail with her father, and the pride in Doug Bell's voice when he speaks of how the Appalachian Trail came across his grandfather's, past his grandfather's front door. In a part of America where the past really matters, the Appalachian Trail lives on, inscribed on the inner landscapes of the people who still remember and are determined not to forget. In this Appalachian heartland, where people's lives are organized around stories of the past and how that past is inextricably woven into their present and their future, memories of the Appalachian Trail and their place in its history remain an important way that they make sense of their world. They wish other people remembered it the way they do, but in the end, all that really matters is that they remember the old trail. So, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Yes.
Yeah, on the where the old trail used to go, is it still a blazed trail? You can hike it. It's just not the official Appalachian Trail. Is it maintained?
So west of the New River, yes, because the Iron Mountain Trail west of the New River, which runs about 140 miles, is the old Appalachian Trail. Okay. And that is maintained by the state of Virginia and by the Forest Service. And it's a multi-use trail, so hikers, horseback, and mountain bikes, but it's very lightly used. I've hiked, 40 miles of it, something like that, and I saw 3 horses and 1 mountain biker and a couple of hikers. So in that whole 40 miles, so it's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Giant ferns, almost to the top of your head. They're so tall, and the views are spectacular. And so if you like hiking in a place that is uncrowded, the Iron Mountain Trail is great. On the east side of the river, there are little bits and pieces, but a lot of it was road walking. So on old abandoned roads, and so you would need the trail guide from there, like 5 different trail guides, because they issued during that 20-year stretch, and it would tell you, turn right at the county line, Baptist church or whatever. But there are little bits and pieces that stretch where that old shelter is. In the Rocky Knob Recreation Area, there's along the Blue Ridge Parkway. There's a stretch up on Bent Mountain. There's a stretch near the Bent Mountain Falls. So they're just little, and down near the Blue Ridge Music Center on the North Carolina border on the Blue Ridge Parkway. There's about 15 miles there that goes up and over Fisher's Peak and then back down again. It's not Fisher's Peak. I'm blanking on the name all of a sudden. But so it is Fisher's Peak. It's Farmer Mountains on the other side of the river. So Fisher's Peak, and that's, I will say, if you decide to go in the fall, Fisher's Peak is heavily hunted. It's a wildlife management area, so it's not a great place to hike during deer season. I say that from personal experience. Wearing lots of orange and still hearing a lot of gunfire. So, but yeah, so there are little bits and pieces east of the New River, west of the New River. You can hike 140 miles of the little trail. And the trail, you can hike over the pinnacles of Dan. The power company is now a Scandinavian power company that controls those dams and so that real estate. And you have to get a permit to go in, but they're very happy to give people permits. And they just stipulate that you have to hike with someone because they had somebody fall in the gorge a few years ago and got really seriously injured and had to be helicoptered out. And so they decided and that person was hiking by himself and so was missing for like 24 hours. So they decided they didn't want any more of that. And, but they're very happy to give people permits. And,
Is that where the Indian Ladder is?
Yeah, so the Indian Ladder it's on the northeast face of the Dan River Gorge, and you cannot hike the Indian Ladder anymore. the Indian ladder was a granite slope like this that the Cherokee had carved handholds into. And the old trail guides say, do not attempt if wet. And the Primlin Resort, which is on that side of the gorge, where you can stay if you want for like $450 a night and get a seaweed wrap and pay $25 for a cocktail and all that. But they own that little piece of land, and one of their guests slid down the Indian ladder and got hurt pretty badly, so they blocked that off.
Have you hiked most of the trail?
No, I'm about 600 miles into my lifetime section hike, but I'm going to retire soonish, and then I'll have more time for hiking. And so like my section starts, here in Northern Virginia and kind of goes like that.
Okay.
So from a little north of the Susquehanna River all the way down to Dragon's Tooth, and then in South Central Virginia, and then the whole Grayson Highlands down to Damascus, and then so I've hiked almost all of Virginia. I'm lacking like 100 miles, something like that, and then a good bit of North Carolina and Georgia, and little bits and pieces in New England. Yes.
Do you know what happened to the guy who shot all the government people when he was on trial?
Yeah. So his name was Floyd Allen, and he actually was wounded in the shooting because the sheriff did return fire. And by the way, the sheriff urged the judge to disarm everyone that day, and the judge refused, which was a mistake. It was really the last decision he made. But so the sheriff did return fire and wounded Floyd Allen, and so he was arrested there was a saloon across the street, and he made it across the street, and that was it. So, and he spent the rest of his life in prison.
Do you routinely give this presentation? Are you open to giving this presentation again?
Absolutely. I'd love to give this presentation. So, yes.
So where did you kind of start with the research process to like connect with all the folks that you?
I just got in my car, and I thought, well, I'm going to start with the Floyd Public Library, because public libraries are wonderful places, and librarians, especially in small towns, are sort of a cultural connector, and they know everybody and everybody knows them, and they've done story time with all the kids, and all that stuff. And so I thought, well, I'll just drive down to Floyd and go to the public library and talk to the librarians. Because they also might have microfilms of old newspapers or whatever, which they did. They had microfilms of the Floyd press from the 1920s and the 1930s, and so that was really helpful. But as I was driving down there, was right at the beginning of the protests about the Mountain Valley Pipeline, and there were all these homemade no pipeline signs, and so I was just kind of on a fishing expedition, so I just turned and started following the signs, and I found the scar from the Mountain Valley Pipeline. It's just awful, and and then just beyond that was the Nature Conservancy owns a little chunk of land there where Bent Mountain Falls is. The falls are not in the Nature Conservancy land, but the parking area is. And so I went there, Bottom Creek Gorge it's called, and I kind of poked around and I found a little piece of the trail. I was like, ooh, I found some of the old Appalachian Trail. And so, and then I talked to some documentary filmmakers who were making a documentary about the Mountain Valley Pipeline protests, and so it took me a long time to get to the library, but I finally got there, talked to the librarian, and then she said, sort of the question, you asked, well, would you like to come and give a talk about what you're working on? And I said, sure. And so a month later, I came back, and while I was there, I gave my talk about what I was trying to figure out and what I already knew, and Doug Bell walked up to me afterwards, and he said, the trail used to go across my grandfather's farm where I grew up. You want to come see it? And I said, you bet. And so the next day, we went up there, and so, and Doug's another guy. Like, he said to me once, he said, I know we have very different politics, but that's okay. So, and he and his wife Arlene have become good friends, and so, then Doug said, well, you should talk to this person, and so just trying to cascade it from there. So I started with the public library.
And then how long did it take you to kind of get all the interviews?
Well, it would have taken a year less if COVID hadn't happened. So if we subtract the COVID year, it took 2 full years between archival research and driving around and talking to people. And there's a guy that features in the book named Jim McNeely, who was extraordinarily helpful to me, very, very generous. Jim is on a crusade to prove that Earl Schaefer was not the first through hiker. This is his life. He's a retired lawyer from West Virginia. This is his life's obsession. And he's kind of given up because he's getting old for fighting with people. And he said, and nobody's listening to me. I'm tired of people not listening to me. So, but he was just so nice to me. And he had kind of an encyclopedic knowledge of the old trail because his view is that Earl Schaefer skipped parts of the trail in that section, and so that's why he wasn't the first through hiker. He was almost a through hiker in Jim's view, but not quite. So he believes Gene Espy was the first through hiker. So, but he drove me all over the place, and so he was really, really helpful. Yeah.
You know, in reading the book, one gets the sense of the sort of level of trust, the hospitality that these people like Bernard's had for the hikers that came through. Yeah. And how I wonder, if that still exists. That it kind of sounds like it does.
It does.
In your
certainly in my experience, it does.
Yeah. Do you sense any change down there? I mean, is it
so? Not in people's level of hospitality, no. And a couple of people did say to me, kind of wistfully, we don't trust one another the way we used to, and they were sad about that. But people just could have been more open and willing to chat. And now I will say, I had an inn, and my inn was, I'm originally from Franklin County, just the next county over. So the first question is not who are you, what do you do? It's where are you from? And I would say, well, I'm originally from Franklin County. My father taught at Ferrum College, and then we moved to Northern Virginia when I was little. I was not even 6 years old when I was at Falls Church. Oh, you're from here? Well, sort of, No. Okay, so you're a Kelly. So, are you related to the Kellys up on Kelly's Knob? And I say, no, my mother's from Atlanta, my father's from Tampa. I'm the only person in my whole extended family born in the Commonwealth of Virginia. But you spell your name the same way they do, And are you sure? And they would always keep circling back to that. Well, because there's Kelly's store. I have a picture of Kelly's store in the book. There's Kelly's store up there on the Parkway. Now, you're sure those weren't your people? And I'm positive those were not my people. But so so we had. I had that advantage. If I had said, "Oh, I'm from Manhattan," they would have said, "Oh." And it would have taken a little. I think they sold it.
Take some time to break them down.
It would have taken a little longer. But these were people who really wanted to meet you and talk to you and all that. So it's just I had an easier path into those conversations. Other questions?
Could you talk a little bit about the sort of the really early vision for the Appalachian Trail? The Benton, McKay, and his vision and how that either got.
What a lot of people don't realize is that the Appalachian Trail was a socialist project, and McKay was a Harvard socialist, and he was a regional planner, watershed management person for the Forest Service, and he did a lot of work on the TVA when that was getting started, and he was into resource management basically, and but he kind of a part-time journalist, and he'd never been really successful in his life, and kind of bounced from one job to another, got fired from a couple. His wife, Betty, was a really prominent suffragette in the United States, and she was way more prominent than he was, and but she also had some psychiatric problems and committed suicide in 1921, and he felt really responsible for that. He was trying to take her to a sanatorium. They were living in New York City. He was trying to take her to a sanatorium, and while he was buying the train tickets, she slipped away from him and threw herself in the East River and drowned, and he felt horribly guilty about this. And so a friend of his, who was the editor of the Journal of the American Institute of Landscape Architecture, invited him to come stay at that guy's farm, and said, "So what are you working on these days, Benton?" And he said, "Well, I had this idea for a trail that would go from the highest point in the south, Mount Mitchell, to the highest point in the north, Mount Washington. It would run along the spine of the Appalachians, and it would be a place for workers to go and get some fresh air." because you have to remember this is 1921, so we just got out of the First World War. More than 1 million people have died of influenza from the pandemic, and industrial labor in the United States was really dangerous in those days. It was just loud and horrible. And Mackay, because he was a socialist, he was really worried about those workers. He didn't spend much time with workers. He didn't have a lot of personal experience with workers. So they were more of a theoretical construct for him. But he wasn't wrong that they needed fresh air. And so the reason that the Appalachian Trail runs so close to all the big cities of the East Coast is because Mackay wanted this trail idea that he had to, if it happened, he wanted it to be easy for working class people to access, which meant in 1921 taking a train or in some cases a bus. And because, not that many people had cars in 1921. And the ones who did were middle class, upper middle class, or wealthy, not working class. And so that's why the trail's so close to all these big cities, and so they would be easy for working class people to access. Because he didn't spend a lot of time with workers, he didn't understand that working class people on their day off, because in the 1920s, most people were working 6 days a week if they were laborers, and or 5.5 days a week, and so on their day off, they didn't want to go hiking, they wanted to go build a trail in the mountains, they wanted to go to the pub, they wanted to go to a baseball game, they wanted to just sleep. They wanted to hang out with their children. They didn't want to get on the train and pay money that was scarce in their families to get to the mountains to hike around. Middle class people, on the other hand, they wanted to do that. They had the whole weekend. Apparently, some of them were working 4-day work weeks, from what I can tell, and so taking Friday off was nothing in the warm weather, and so it was middle class people who really built the trail. And so, like if you want to walk on the oldest stretch of the trail south of the Potomac River, just go out to Linden and where the trail crosses Route 55 and park at either one of the trailheads on either side of the road and just walk on the trail, because that was the original part of the trail. Because the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club started in 1927, they started working on the trail south of the Potomac. And they took the train to Linden, used to be a train station there. They'd get off with their tools and just start working their way north to Paris, Virginia, or south to Skyland Lodge, now in Shenandoah. And so that's really the oldest section of the trail south of the Potomac. But so anyway, Mackay published this article in this obscure landscape architecture journal, and trail clubs started calling, mostly from the Northeast, started calling and saying, "Hey, I read your article. That's amazing. Can you come talk to our club?" And he's sure. Nobody had ever been interested in anything he'd written, just saying. And so all of a sudden he felt kind of like a minor celebrity, and they would pay for it. He was always broke, always broke. And so they would pay for him to come and stay in a nice hotel. They would feed him. He was charmed by that too. And I'll just say as a footnote, there's no evidence that Benton Mackay ever spent one night on the Appalachian Trail. He was a rambler. He liked to go on rambles, and when he was a young man, he'd gone backpacking and camping. But by the time he proposed the Appalachian Trail, he was in his mid-40s, and I've never seen any evidence that he spent a night in a trail shelter or in a tent along the trail. He liked to stay in lodges along the trail where trail clubs would put him up. He could give a little talk, and then he would go hiking with them, as long as it resulted in being back at the lodge for dinner. But he lived into the 1970s. He died in 1975 at the age of 95. And just before he died, somebody from the Forest Service came and interviewed him about his work with the Forest Service. And so by 1975, through hiking had really become a thing, or was becoming a thing. But just hiking and backpacking was really, really popular by the 70s. And so this guy from the Forest Service said to him, in this interview, he's like, "Yeah, Benton, can you believe it? There are almost 200 people trying to hike the whole trail this year." And they had this big chuckle about how many people that was. This spring, at Springer Mountain in Georgia, there was one day where 160 people all started on the same day hiking north. And so, something like 4,000 people are trying to through hike this year. And, maybe 1,000 of them will make it.
Is that what it is? 25%?
Yeah, it's about 20-25%. Mostly they get, most people start in Georgia, most people make it 40 miles. And largest number of people who drop out in one place drop out at the 40-mile point because there's a backpacking store and a little mini lodge there and a paved road. And the people who run mountain crossings, the store there, they will call you a cab back to the Atlanta airport. So lots of people realize, wow, this is kind of hard. And I think the next biggest dropout point is probably Harper's Ferry, because it's not the halfway point, but it's the sort of emotional halfway point. And by then you've hiked 1,000 miles, give or take, and so I think a lot of people by then a lot of people get bored.
Virginia isn't Virginia the kind of boring?
Yeah, they call it the Virginia Blues. Because it's 525 miles of the trails in Virginia. It's a quarter of the whole trail.
It's very Disney where the roller coaster is.
Yeah, it's just they hike through. Well, through hikers don't think the roller coaster is hard because they've hiked 1,000 miles.
My brother thought it was hard. So dropped out.
So they, or they get into Pennsylvania where the trail is north of the Susquehanna. The trail is just walking on rocks for like 100 miles, and they at some point, it just gets boring. It really gets boring, and it gets unboring when you get to Vermont, and all of a sudden you're moving back into real mountains again and alpine terrain, and then you feel like, oh, I'm in Vermont. There are only 3 states to Mount Katahdin, so still 600 miles. But a lot of people, they just get bored, and it just turns out to be a lot harder than they thought it was going to be. A lot of young people do it these days for the rolling party. It's kind of a movable feast kind of thing, and at some point that stops being exciting. So, well, thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for